EU at UCL. Yes, it is being recorded. And of course, the Development Studies Association. We are expecting the Environment Minister from Colombia to join us any second now. We have heard from him confirming his participation this morning. Unfortunately, Major Carlos Mario Marin from Manizales at the last minute had to cancel his participation, so we're very sorry we won't be able to hear from him. It'll be just the five of us. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the participants. Feel free to introduce yourself later on if you wish to do so. I'll start with Dr. Linda Etchert from Kingston University. She's a lecturer in human geography at the University of Kingston in the UK. She has published work on conflict transformation, post-conflict reconstruction, women's peace movements, transnational networks, and indigenous environmental activism, amongst others. We've just heard from her that she's sitting in Manhattan, New York today. Thank you, Dr. Etchert, for joining us. We also have Mr. Andrés Patiño from the Área Metropolitana del Valle de Aburrá, the metropolitan area of the Aburrá Valley in Colombia. He holds a master's in law and development from the University of Melbourne in Australia. He currently serves as the senior legal counsel for the institution that I just mentioned, metropolitan area of the Aburrá Valley, which, by the way, is the environmental authority for the metropolitan city of Medellin in Colombia. Mr. Patiño is also a lecturer in global commercial contract law and research at one of the local universities. We will be joined by Mr. Carlos Correa. He is the Minister for the Environment and Sustainable Development in the Republic of Colombia. Under his direction, Colombia was able to build a very strong NDC and a highly ambitious 2050 strategy, which has been agreed by all economic sectors in Colombia. He also led the introduction of the climate action law in Colombia. We hope to hear from him on that matter. He was also mayor of a large city in Colombia called Monteria during the 2012-2015 term, and the city was ranked as a very well-recognized sustainable city during that period. My name is Carlos Cadena. I will be moderating this session. I am a professor at EAFIT University in Medellin, Colombia. I also have served as Transport Secretary for the city of Medellin in Colombia, and I have a PhD from the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. With me is Maria Camila Flores, who also serves as convener to this session. She is a political scientist from the National University in Colombia and currently works within the Climate Governance Project at EAFIT University. All right, with that said, I'll provide a very brief introduction. I'm hearing that the minister will be joining us in 5 minutes, so we'll probably start with some opening remarks from Dr. Etchert and Mr. Patiño, and then we will welcome the Minister Correa. We would like to sort of provide a general introduction to climate governance and why we chose to propose this idea on the South and North co-creation very rapidly, and keeping in mind that this session is being recorded, I'd like to offer 3 ideas. The first one is that the climate crisis is by far the world's biggest threat. The IPCC in 2021, in its 6th assessment report, shared that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, our ocean, our land. And in 2022, the mitigation report also mentioned that mitigation pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees Celsius involve deep, rapid, and sustained emissions reduction. So we should definitely hold that in mind. Secondly, climate change is a borderless crisis. There are no borders, no administrative borders to this crisis. Thus, the reason why we have proposed our session on climate governance. Mitigation and adaptation to climate change is a cross-boundary, multi-level, multi-sector, and multi-actor challenge. According to Ostrom, this potentially is the largest collective action dilemma the world has ever faced. And thirdly, a 1.5 degrees Celsius consistent pathway requires engagement between various levels and types of governance. That's the relevance of the title and the idea proposed in this panel in the context of a planetary climate crisis. Our boundaries are embedded with a social, political context. We have seen very interesting videos by Dr. Etcher, by Mr. Patiño, by the minister himself. And I would like to start with opening remarks by Dr. Etcher and Mr. Patiño on that order. Dr. Etcher, would you like to offer your opening remarks for this panel, please?
Yes. My work is very much about global governance and the role of indigenous peoples in global governance. So my article from 2017 was entitled "The Role of Indigenous Peoples in Combating Climate Change." So I have been doing primary research in the Ecuadorian Amazon with indigenous communities who are engaged in participating in climate governance. So the same people that I did the primary research with, many of them appeared at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues within at the UN conference, which happens every April. So it's been very interesting to see, since the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's very interesting to see since 2007 the engagement of indigenous individuals and communities participating in global governance of the environment and combating climate change. And my book, which came out this year, which had just come out, Global Governance of the Environment, Indigenous Peoples and the Rights of Nature, is really looking at, I suppose it's a holistic view, but very much based in sort of empirical work. So what I've done is sort of go beyond the United Nations into, I suppose, international sort of financial institutions, the World Bank, and to look at how global governance of the environment fails, why it fails, what the obstacles are to successful global environmental governance, looking at how the situation should be win-win, because everybody is singing from the same song sheet, everybody wishes to save the planet, save the forest, save the indigenous peoples. So I have looked at corporate social responsibility, oil companies, Chinese mining companies. So in terms of private companies, their websites, everybody is obeying the rules, so to speak. They're all signing up to the international conventions and treaties. So it looks as if it should be win-win. And I think what I found I mean, I've been looking into this for several years now, what I found is that what we've ended up with is lose-lose, because those same laws, international law, has been used to create consequences which are the opposite for the ones that are intended. And I've just actually published an article in a law journal on that theme, which is indigenous people in the Ecuadorian Amazon and their relationship to international law, and how international law has really failed them. So what this has led me to is to look at what are the forces working against international law, and particularly in Ecuador in the last year, or certainly in the last 2 years, 3 years, there's been a sort of capture by organized crime, which I think ultimately is going to be damaging to indigenous peoples and to the environment and to the rights of nature. But it's not just the illegal logging or the illegal mining or the illegal gold mining, it's also, I suppose, the legal activities. So in terms of the corporations being able to produce environmental impact assessments of 1,000 pages in which they justify all of their actions and are able to comply with international law and state law, Ecuadorian law, and laws regarding the rights of nature. And I go on to unofficial payments to individuals within oil companies or within the government, and how that in turn, I suppose it's the blurring of the lines between the legal and the illegal, and the impact this has on indigenous peoples and the environment. So I think I've probably gone over time here, so thank you.
No. Don't worry. It was great as an opening statement, and it also provides a very interesting turn for Mr. Patiño, who, by the way, is an expert in some of the issues that you've just mentioned. But before handing it over to him, I'd like to briefly announce some of the great remarks that you've just shared with us. Everybody is obeying rules, so we've pretty much ended up with a lose-lose situation. That was fantastic. And you sort of provide the following question: how can we provide the possibility for a win-win situation? You've also told us a little bit about corporations justifying their actions and complying with all sorts of laws and regulation, but a very interesting sort of blurring lines between what they do and what they should be doing, etc. So, Mr. Patiño, I do not want to force you to touch upon those two issues, but I do know that you're an expert on that. So I wanted to briefly summarize that. Before handing it over to you for your opening statement, I'd like to welcome the Minister Carlos Correa, who has joined us a couple of minutes ago. So I believe he did hear to your full opening statement, Dr. Etcher. We will continue with Mr. Patiño. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Well, my topic is about forest governance. I will present a critical approach from the Global South perspective to the REDD+ projects. This is a topic that is explained in the post-colonial context and trying to understand how sustainable development nowadays is a new orthodoxy of the new developmental state. So my central argument is how developed countries may use REDD+ projects and the carbon market just to buy quotas of GHG emissions to keep their consumption levels and sustain the economic growth at the expenses of the third world. To explain this argument, I analyze 3 issues in the Colombian context. One is how the mechanisms to set up the carbon stocks price is defined by developed countries and international institutions, and how the low price of carbon stock in the market is affecting the development of REDD+ initiatives in Colombia. The second issue is the limitation of the results-based payment system and its negative implications. And the last one is the impact of REDD+ projects over local communities and on the Colombian indigenous rights. in that way, I think that we already shared some questions Linda already posted in the website, and I also posted some questions for her, and because I had the opportunity to read her work. She shared with me some of her work, and it's really interesting. And I think that they are really connected, especially because the context of the Ecuador and Colombia are very similar in that way.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting approach to what you've offered to us, and I sincerely look forward that both of you can connect with each other and continue working together. I think there's much in common in your work. Mr. Environment Minister of Colombia, Carlos Correa, welcome and thank you so much, querido ministro, for joining us. Thank you for your time. I know your schedule is hectic these days. Welcome, Carlos Correa.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel and this event today. I extend my greetings to Carlos Cadena Gaitán, amigo y profesor de AFIT University, a Andrés José Patiño, también Legal Counsel of the Metropolitan Area of the Aburrá Valley, a Linda Eckhart, lecturer at Kingston University. So I would like to make 3 remarks on the video I sent to the organizers on climate governance. The central message is that to stand to the challenge of climate change, we have first to create a robust institutions that stand the test of time and have the capacity to change and adapt to the circumstances. Thus, my first remark is about the creation of the CISCLIMA in 2016. The CISCLIMA is the national system of the climate change. It has a cross-cutting focus between sectors and public actors and coordinates which actions have to be done by whom to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One of the main attributes of the CISCLIMA that I would like to point out is the National Strategy on Climate Finance, as it seeks to align our national projects with the Climate Green Fund criteria. In fact, since 2015, Colombia has managed 35 different projects and mobilized up to $613 million, being the 4th country in the region with the most funds from the GCF. Previously, I told you that the CISCLIMA had a cross-cutting focus, and it can be seen when we see the Intersectorial Committee on Climate Change, the CICC, which coordinates the CISCLIMA. In the SIC, there is a place for all points of view: foreign affairs, finance, environment, energy, and much more. So there can be a growing consensus on what has to be done and how it can be done. My second remark is based on the 2018 climate change law, which moved forward our institutions because it saw a deeper territorial and multi-sectoral focus. For example, it has provided the baselines for the development of integral plans for climate management in more than 20 Colombian states, and in industries as important as commerce, energy, and transport, with a defined set of actions and goals for 2030. And my third remark is a special one, as it has been a significant advance under my term as Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development. It is the approval of the Climate Action Law in December 2021, which gives legal strength to our national determined contribution. In other words, it's our climate constitution, because it provides all the effective tools and actions we must do to bind our future to a reduction of 51% in the greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The Climate Action Law led to the creation of the implementation plan of the NDCs. This plan involves more than 90 institutions and 232 actions in mitigation, adaptation, and implementation needs. A step forward to be achieved our climate ambition. As well, the Climate Action Law set an experts commission on carbon markets, in which local and foreign experts give us an accurate recommendation of how to advance in the path to having our own emissions trading system by 2025. These three milestones, the creation of the CISCLIMA, the climate change law in 2018, and the climate action law in 2021, have been fundamental in the fight against climate change and the strengthening of the climate governance. Today, I look back and see progress. By the end of this year, Colombia will have increased its renewable power generation capacity by a factor of 100 compared to 2018. There are also more than 6,000 electric vehicles on our roads, and our goal is to have 600,000 by 2030. In less than 1 month, we will have protected the 30% of our national territory and 8 years before planned. Today, we have move forward in voluntary carbon markets and our carbon tax, as well as the development of the initiative finance tools at the green taxonomy. Climate governance will be a way to truly reach the goal of a sustainable future and transform our promises into actions. Climate governance has been built across governments, and it will remain so in the future. As a common purpose of the Colombian state and citizens, of course, and therefore a panel like this is an excellent opportunity to understand what has been achieved and what can we achieve if we listen more, coordinate more, and act more. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the next hours of this event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for your work. The minister will probably stay with us for a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes, hopefully. But if not, we sincerely welcome him in the next sessions and thank him for joining us today. I'd like to get back at some of the points that the Environment Minister from Colombia just touched upon, particularly to some that could be in interaction with some of the contributions by Dr. Etchert and Mr. Patiño. He talks about robust institutions, providing an example related to the Colombian context, CISCLIMA. He also talked about the 2018 climate change law and particularly about what he calls the climate constitution. Never really heard that before, but I thought it was very interesting. I know that Mr. Patiño is also thinking about that right this second. But in order to summarize that idea behind the climate constitution, he's really talking about the climate action law that was passed by the Colombian Congress in 2021. We do agree that it is a very interesting platform for future action. I'd like to return the word to Dr. Etchert, and before returning to you, Dr. Etchert, I'd like to specifically mention that I couldn't help to notice that you sort of grabbed your new book from somewhere around your desk. So please show us the book so that we can actually see it and take a screenshot or something, because I would like to look for it and buy it so that I can read it and then come back to you for some additional questions. Can we see your book?
I've got 8 slides. I can just skip through them in about 1 minute. If I can, I'll just try to share my screen. Am I able to share my screen? Possibly.
Absolutely. If our IT support gives us a hand, I'm sure you can do it. Thank you. We can now see your screen.
Oh, you can, right. If I do slideshow, it
We
might
can.
work. You can see it anyway.
Perfect. Yes.
No, I don't. I'm pressing the wrong one. You can see it from current slide. Can you see that? Is that better? Is that bigger?
Yes.
I'll show you.
Yes, we can.
So this is the book with the context and themes, which is why has global environmental governance failed? And ultimately, I follow the money. And I'm really looking at markets for oil, markets for logs, markets for trafficked wildlife. So I'm sort of going all the way through to look at the role of investment management companies in particular, and the investment sector and environmental, social and governance investment. So I'm looking at really at the market and demand rather than supply. So I'm looking for solutions partly in the market. And I think one of the problems is, as we discussed before, multiple accountability disorder. There are 3,600 or were at least 3,600 environmental agreements, international agreements in 2020. So I think there's a lack of coordination among the different United Nations agencies. And also I think there's an involvement in NGOs. So there's a kind of a lack of coordination in order to make a real difference. And just to go through to my conclusion, which is really that we need to have transparency all around in terms of profits for companies, where those profits go, and the question of tax havens, and particularly the amount of GDP that's lost through diversion of money into tax havens. So the various sort of whistleblowing elements, such as the Panama Papers, particularly the Paradise Papers and the Pandora Papers, have revealed how much of government funds have been diverted, government resources which could be invested in social programs or in deforestation, how much those have been diverted into tax havens. So that's really my conclusion. If that answers your question.
It does, and I wasn't aware that you had the slides right there next to you. I thought we were only get to see the actual book. So congrats and thank you for being prepared. Going back to Mr. Patiño, I'd like to ask you about what Linda mentioned earlier, and she says how to move towards a win-win situation. But before asking that, I'd like to point out two very interesting contributions by Dr. Etchert and the minister. First one is that she says that she focused in the market in relation to those demand rather than supply possibilities. And secondly, the minister did mention something that I know is core to your work, Andres. He says, we will be ready with an emissions trading system by 2025 in Colombia. So with that in mind, I'd like to pose Dr. Etchert's question to you. How to move towards a win-win situation?
Well, I don't know if the minister is still connected, but I want to use this opportunity to say thank you. As a Colombian, I'm proud of the work and the commitment of this government to the climate change. So thank you so much. On the other hand, I consider that the opportunity to say or to establish a win-win context needs to restate the relation between the global north and the global south, because we can face the climate change in the post-colonial context using just colonial tools. We have bad experience in the past, like the debt crisis, which is repeating right now due to COVID-19. So I think that the commitment of countries like the US, China, and India, it's a critical need to face and to tackle climate change right now. I will happy to answer the question that Linda posted in the website. She answered. She said that, do you feel that overall REDD+ had been a mistake? Well, my short answer would be no. I think that protecting the forest to deforestation drivers will be necessary, but the question is must be what is at stake. And she said, do you think that if it had been applied in a different way with more local participation, that it might have been more successful in achieving its objectives in terms of the application, implementation of payments for environmental services to protect the environment? Well, my answer here should be that REDD projects should be restated in terms of the mechanisms to set up the carbon prices. So it's a good news that Colombia has in its plans implementing carbon trading and emission systems, which is necessary to include another kind of services. The second is that we need to include non-carbon benefits and other ecological services of forests by setting up the prices, such as, for example, biodiversity protection and the indigenous people livelihood. It's a necessity for the forest. The other important thing to restate REDD+ is the free, prior, and informed consent. This process should be redefined considering the level of knowledge and understanding of peasant and indigenous people, because the consent should be informed in terms of the capacities of understanding. And the last one is the payment system. The performance-based payment instead of a result-based payment, it's a necessity because the result-based payment is not attractive for landowners because of their long-lasting terms for payments. So they have to wait about 5 years to receive their first payments. So the implementation phase is very expensive and delayed. So they prefer to use the land for other purposes. In this regard, Colombia has a massive issue because of the drug cartels, considering that the drugs are much more profitable than REDD+ projects. So there is also a loss of control of the territories, which are controlled by illegal groups and drug lords. So that it's my opinion about the questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was, by the way, the answer to one of the questions that Dr. Etchert posted on the online forum. So thank you for doing that, Mr. Patiño. Dr. Etchert, you received a question in our chat. Ogeto wrote, this is a very interesting session. Is it possible to have the slides and the open access book? Would you like to briefly answer that?
About open access of procurement contracts. Sorry, what were you referring to?
I'm not sure what the person who wrote that was referring to. I believe he or she was wanting to have access to both the slides that you've just shared and the open access book.
Okay.
I wonder if
I can put those details in the chat. There's an open access article published in law journals 2 days ago. So I'll put my email. I think perhaps I'll put my email in the chat and then you can email me. But certainly if you click on Law's Journal, you'll find the latest issue, volume 44, number 4, I think it is. And there's an open access article on this particular theme. And it does cover the illegal gold mining around Tena, not far from Quito, on the tributaries of the Amazon River, and how it actually covers how Colombian and other, I think, cartels associated with some of the narcotics cartels have moved into the gold mining area that had been left by a Chinese company. So they were carrying out large-scale illegal gold mining between June 21 to December 21, through to February 2022. So I think it's very interesting to see how the government responded to that, and eventually they did send in the troops. But I think we're looking at sort of major obstacles to the aspirations of the governments. I mean, I think certainly in terms of Ecuador, they've lost, to some extent, the government have lost control, certainly of the coastal areas. So governance itself is sort of under threat. I mean, I think there's limits to the power of governments, and I think we're underestimating the power of the sort of international criminal economy that goes all the way to the mafia of Italy. So I think what's really interesting is the markets for the products and the markets for the gold. I mean, I believe that 90% of the illegal gold mined from Ecuador has gone to China. So Ecuador's become the 9th biggest exporter of gold ore, which I think, you know, is a new phenomenon. And to go back to the Red Plus and Andres's question, I think in Ecuador the problem with the Red Plus from the indigenous perspective is that it was not under their control, and they feel that it's top down, and that the payments first, it's not clear as to who the payments are going to, but they feel that they're subject to conditionalities, and that means that if they don't comply with the conditionalities, if they don't follow the instructions by those who are imposing the Red Plus or Sociobosque in this case, that they're going to be penalized. And there's another problem with that. I mean, first, there's a problem with free, prior, and informed consent because of the way that the consultations are conducted. So I think there's been a general rejection of most of the consultations, certainly among those whom I know in Ecuador. So I think that in itself is a big problem. There's certainly a lack of trust, but also, I mean, I think it's unlike in Colombia. The payments, I think, have been quite quick in Ecuador, and I know that Red Plus has worked, or Sociobosque has worked in several places. So there are people who are for and there are people who are against. But I think one of the unfortunate aspects of Red Plus in Ecuador is that the government retained the right to drill for oil, and for oil companies to prospect for oil and drill for oil in the areas covered by sociobosque. So, I mean, that seems to be a kind of a contradiction there, that it's not sustainable. So I think in terms of the indigenous communities who are resisting the extraction of oil from their territories, they felt betrayed because they got payment to save the forest, and they were resisting the oil companies, and the oil companies were moving in anyway. So I think there's, with reference to sort of Andres's work, I think that the aspirations, as with, you know, state law, the rights of nature and indigenous rights, the aspirations are there. The mechanism should be there, but somehow the mechanisms are undermined in practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Etcher. I insist, I am extremely excited about the connection that clearly we've made between Dr. Etcher and Mr. Patiño. I insist that I look forward in you collaborating in some sort, in some way. I know there's much in common between both of you. The person who asked that for you, Dr. Etcher, in our chat, did answer back and say, please share your email, and also asked for Mr. Patiño's email. If both of you don't mind sharing that in our chat, feel free to do so. And we are reaching our final section before providing an opportunity for any questions or comments from our public. Do bear in mind that this session is being recorded. I'd like to share one final question for both of you, Dr. Etcher and Mr. Patiño, and it has to do with the fact that both of you have experience in particular contexts, Ecuador and Colombia, neighboring countries with particular variables. You've shared about that already during this session, but I'd like you to think about an additional variable, and I'd like to push you forward towards the idea of what climate governance has to do with, I'm going to say, co-produced strategies with civil society, private sector. We've heard a lot about private sector today, specifically in some of the ideas about the role of corporations. Of course, co-production with local, regional, and national authorities, and particularly for both of you, I'd like to respectfully push you to share with us your ideas regarding the role of indigenous peoples, the possibility for indigenous peoples, the challenges for indigenous peoples to collaborate in co-produced strategies in order to improve climate governance. I'd like to share a very brief idea regarding this. In Medellin, in particular, where I live and work, where Camila lives and works, both of us have been working on a co-produced strategy to improve climate governance for the city of Medellin. So we're very much looking forward to hearing your ideas on that. And I would also like to provide special thanks to Dr. Andrea Rigon, who I see has been accompanying this session throughout. Professor Andrea Rigon from the DPU at UCL also has provided very kind advice to this particular project. So I don't know, Dr. Etcher, Mr. Patiño, if you'd like to share some ideas on this very difficult question, but I have seen from both of your statements that you probably have interesting ideas on co-production for climate governance, and specifically in relation to indigenous peoples in the context of Colombia and or Ecuador. Who'd like to start?
Andres, do you want to start?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that the co-creation process it must be differentiated between the local context and the international context. In the local context, I think that, for example, in Colombia, we need a real process of governance, which means a real or genuine integration on interaction between the government and the community. The information, it's the clue of all this situation, because the appropriation of the knowledge, it's an excellent tool to integrate the communities. In that way, as I was explaining, the free, prior, and informed consent must be integrated to the governance process. Otherwise, in the international context, I consider that the fragmentation of the international law and the lack of bindingness of enforcement, which is known like inorganic bindingness, should present like a fail, because there is not an international forum such as the International Court of Justice in terms of environmental protection. So I, as an international lawyer, I consider that there is like a dichotomy between the sovereignty principle and the protection of the environment as a global good for all people. So it's my insight. I don't know if it answered your
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for the contribution. Dr. Etcher.
I would certainly echo that. I mean, in terms of there not being an international criminal court of the environment. I mean, they've been trying for so many years, as you know, to set it up, and it hasn't happened. And there are no binding. It's so difficult to prosecute multinational companies. And I do agree that we need all sectors to work together. So we have to bring on board, certainly, you know, governments, the Chinese government in particular. I mean, they are making efforts, and the laws have changed in China. So it is possible to have some kind of accountability for Chinese companies operating abroad. And in terms of the sort of co-governance, South and North, I mean, I think the uprising in Ecuador over the last couple of weeks, I think, is telling. I mean, the 10 demands of the indigenous groups under Leonidas Issa Salazar was very interesting, and they succeeded. I mean, it's ongoing, and Leonidas Issa is still being prosecuted, but I do think the indigenous people's involvement in government is essential. I think they need to have quotas, some kind of consociational government, and sort of guaranteed seats and ministries. I mean, that has all happened in the past. I think perhaps it can happen again to increase the power of indigenous communities and of African communities and different marginalized communities in Ecuador. I mean, they're looking at a sort of federal system as a possible new form of government. So as we speak, I think that's probably not going to happen. I'm not sure that devolution is necessarily the answer. And I mean, I think having autonomy or self-determination is very important. I don't think the indigenous communities want to be isolated. I think they want to be on the global stage. They want to be considered as important on the global stage, and they want to have equal status at the United Nations as nation states. So I do think ultimately we have to question the whole nation state system, because it seems rather sort of, it doesn't seem to be balanced, shall we say. I'm not sure that the United Nations have their own problems, and you know, I'm slightly concerning that, you know, they're sort of heading towards irrelevance, but certainly on a symbolic level, I think that it's important. So I think there have to be ways of creating major changes within the United Nations as an institution, but also in terms of the global economy. But ultimately, I think the responsibility, there are co-responsibilities from North and South, and certainly the North or the industrialized countries are not facing up to their own responsibilities. And it's our responsibilities as consumers as well. So, I mean, we have to look at ourselves and our own consumption patterns ultimately, and explore, I mean, as within the previous plenary, looking at different epistemologies, alternative epistemologies and alternatives to the sort of market-based, you know, capitalist economy, which I think is, you know, we have to look at the structures which are making it so difficult for indigenous epistemologies to have any traction. So I mean, big changes, it can be aspirational for the long term perhaps, but certainly in the short term, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in Ecuador over the next few months. Thank you.
Lovely, lovely. I do agree with you, Dr. Etcher, that we must question the whole nation-state system. I do wholeheartedly agree. We would need a completely different new space in a new panel in order to discuss that in detail, but thank you for sharing that very polemic idea. And we'll stay with that particular issue of the power balance. We did receive a question in our chat. I'm going to read it out for you in a second. But before I do that, and in order to be mindful of time, please keep your answer short. And if you'd like to share a final statement in order to round up this panel, feel free to do so right this time. We'll only have 6 minutes to go. The question is as follows. What is the power balance of indigenous people with respect to environmental governance? It is similar to what we've just discussed, but the person also suggests that you share some experienced views. Feel free to share your final statement as well, since we're running out of time. We'll start with you, Dr. Etcher, this time.
I think I answered the question in my previous statement, but I certainly think that from my own research, I can see that many of the indigenous communities feel abandoned, ignored, and they have not received a profile on the international stage that they deserve, and they do need to be given greater status or nation state status, equal status that they've been aspiring for within the United Nations since 2017, and they've been denied that because of the interests of state governments who don't want to give them equal status as nations within the nation state system. So I think there are many different ways of achieving a greater profile and greater power for indigenous communities, and I think there have been enormous changes in the last, well, since the beginning of the 21st century. So I think in that sense, we're heading in the right direction. Thank you.
Mr. Patiño, would you like to add something, or would you like to offer a final statement?
No, I agree with Lita, but I just want to complement saying that, for example, in the Colombian context, the power balance may be harmed by political and economical interest because the indigenous peoples are easily corrupted for like Ecuador, for international companies or drug cartels in the Colombian context. So that power should be manipulated by other drivers.
Great, thank you. So we've done it. We've done it. We're right on time. We have 2 minutes to go in order for a final picture. If you would like to show us something for a final screenshot picture, feel free to do it now in 10 seconds. We'll do it. And before we take our final picture, I'd like to honestly thank all of you for joining us, for participating, in particular to the Development Studies Association, to the DPU at UCL and to UCL, and to all of you who participated. So I invite you to show us something for the final screenshot picture right this second.
Oh.
Or just smile if you want. All right. That was great. That was great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll also share my email in the chat in order we can keep in touch. Goodbye. Till the next time.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.